Hello and welcome, everyone, to Season 3, Episode 2 of our Teachers in the Hall podcast. I'm John Zingali, and I enjoy snorkeling, building things with my hands, and of course, coffee. Lots and lots of coffee.
And I'm Erin Lark, and I love cozy sweaters, rewatching Ted Lasso, and I have a Cosmic Crisp in my lunchbox right now. I wanted to take a minute real quick before we get started on this second episode of our Season 3 to have a moment of silence for all the people who are in New Orleans right now, who are at the beginning of their school year and have been impacted by this catastrophic storm. And we just wanted to have a moment for them and all that they are going through.
And words. There's a lot of loss going on right now too. Obviously, hearts go out to the families of the soldiers lost in Afghanistan this last week or so. But also on a personal note, some partnerships and partners and community members that I've developed, some really good relationships over the years have passed away this summer. Christine Colacerdo, I've been working with her and the Mount St. Helens Institute for about 7 years. She was always an amazing guest to have into our school. She wrote a book called Return to Spirit Lake. Her family lost their cabin when the 1980 eruption happened, and she was just always so gracious about coming into the classroom and talking to young kids and talking about her tragedies that she went through over her life. And we lost her way too young. She was only 60 years old. And it just hits a little harder this year because we're getting ready to plan our trip to Mount St. Helens and do our project this year. And I won't be able to have her in the building. And that hits hard a little bit. The other one, too, is Les Anger. And I met him briefly through the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education. Les himself was a Holocaust survivor of both Auschwitz and Dachau. He was definitely older, and this one was a bit more, not necessarily, more expected. He had recently aged, I think he was 93. But he was vitally important in the Pacific Northwest Portland area here with going out and speaking to communities. I met him at a school event. He went out and was speaking to school children about his experiences during the Holocaust, and he was also one of the people instrumental with making the memorial, the Holocaust Memorial in Washington Park in Portland. He even went back with his wife Ava and a couple other Holocaust survivors to Germany and the other places to actually grab soil from all the concentration camps to put it into the memorial here. And I just want to thank him for his service and bringing Holocaust awareness to the forefront, well, hopefully to the forefront of education. As he started speaking out in the 80s, it's not something he ever wanted to do, but when more and more people were denying that it was happening, he couldn't sit silent and let those stories gain traction. And so those people that we've had into the classroom, they've left a mark on myself. They've left a mark on countless children in this Southwest Washington, Portland metro area. And I just want to thank them and honor them for all the work that they've done.
Thank you. So along those lines, when we're bringing up people who have fought hard for causes they believe in and have worked to educate people, a lot of these subjects are happening right now in the wild. And we were looking through Twitter and noticing as the school year is starting, there are terms that are being bandied around, maybe in ways by people who have not defined them academically or defined them in conjunction with where they work and maybe checked in on a broader scale of what they mean. Or maybe it's just people who are curious. I've heard this term. I know that it's an intense term, but I'm not sure why. So we wanted to take just a quick moment to define a couple of those for us, for any listeners, and to encourage you to go forward and ask questions in schools. Be someone who is an exemplary learner and wants to know what is happening in your schools. Before we start forming opinions, or maybe as we're starting to form opinions, make sure that we're asking questions as part of that strategy. And the first one is inclusion. So I was reading a tweet from a parent who said they did not want inclusion because they thought that inclusion meant that they had to have any learning topic in the classroom included. And so reading a little more into that tweet, that parent, and this was, in a different spot in the country, they thought inclusion was about curriculum, when inclusion is actually bigger than that. Generally, here in Southwest Washington and in many other places, inclusion talks about having all learners getting all learning experiences together. So that means that in the past, where we would have, if someone learned differently or needed a different structure, those students would often be pulled out of the classroom and would learn separately, either in one-on-one or small group situations. Inclusion, the way it's generally meant now, means all learners are in the classroom getting all of the learning together, so that we're not separating students out. When we say all, we mean all, every single kid. All means all. We're not separating by groups. We're learning together because we know that there is value for everyone when we all hear from each other. And that's something that, for John and I both, collaboration, not just between staff people, but our teaching is so much more effective, powerful when students get to work with each other and learn from all of the different perspectives and strengths that students bring in. So inclusion is a huge part for us, but also for collaboration. It can't happen without inclusion.
And it is a bit about, especially within the socialized classroom, is making sure voices that had been traditionally left out of the classroom are included into the classroom. Allowing our students, who come from many, many different backgrounds, to see themselves in our country's history, to see themselves in our classrooms, and making sure that they're feeling welcome and included. And once again, that gets to building relationships with your students, right? We as teachers, that's one of the most important things, if not the most important thing that we can do, is build relationships with the students. And when students feel safe and included in their learning, you're going to move them forward exponentially.
Absolutely. And policies, you will often see policies now in education from our legislators that expect inclusion as part of operations. It will happen. So it's not an option either. So that's generally what that term means. And so again, throughout this, we're saying if you are wondering more about that, asking questions is a great way to start.
The other term I've been hearing a lot about throughout the summer and stuff is learning loss. This one just makes my skin crawl a little bit. Because it's like, oh, we need to catch these students up. We need to do this. They lost a year and a half of school. No, they didn't. Did school look dramatically different than it had in the past? Absolutely. But to say that they didn't learn is nonsensical. They did learn. Maybe they didn't learn exactly what we had all planned by our old school ways, but that's okay. They're surviving in the middle of a pandemic and attempting to go to school, and this idea that students are just like they lost out on an entire year, or like they're gonna just, that's our job as educators, is to, wherever they're at, see where they're at and then move them forward. But if we keep focusing on this negative connotation, like they didn't learn, that what's that going to do for a kid's psyche? That's not including them in their learning. Rather, I just want to take them where they're at and move them forward.
I agree. One of my mentors, Michael Werner, and I were talking about this because students will learn in spite of, or because of, or alongside their teacher. And so what that looks like could be different. It could be different all over the world. Students are at this fantastic spot in their development as a young human where they are going to observe. They are going to absorb from their environment. And because learning was different does not mean that it didn't happen. And it might have happened in ways that were really great for that child too. And so we want to be really careful with our assumptions. And so, thinking about learning loss is a little bit of that deficit thinking, that deficit mindset of where, this is a problem, instead of, okay, so this was not what we intended, obviously, and in some cases was very tragic. But we're going to move forward together, and children will be learning. Yeah. So flipping that script can be really important.
And just another point, too, is, there's been studies out there where, traditional schooling kids are memorizing stuff for a test and then they don't remember it 3 months later anyway. So, you know, even if they were studying for a test, you know, if we're not shifting what education is completely, then, you know, there was learning loss before too.
There was learning loss before.
You know, but guess what? We saw where the kids were at when they got to us in the beginning of the school year or whenever they come to us, and we move them forward. That's our job as teachers.
Exactly. And that brings us to our last sort of pairing of terms that are hot buttons now in a lot of parts of the country. And those are CRE, which stands for Culturally Responsive Education. And then we have CRT. CRT has two definitions. One could be culturally responsive teaching, so very close to culturally responsive education. The other could be critical race theory. And so I just want to mention briefly, because these topics are wonderful, in-depth pieces that we are not going to go in depth with today, but just to give some education side to this. Culturally responsive education is when students experience education that embraces, supports, amplifies, provides voice to, all of those things of diverse cultures, is inclusive, has all of those pieces going for it. And culturally responsive teaching, CRT in that sense, means that teachers are intentionally changing their practice to be culturally responsive and inclusive, and to step out of wherever their own biases have taken them, to expand their planning, to really work hard to give every student access to the learning in a way that is meaningful and powerful to their perspective, their lived experience.
Yeah. And CRT, as we have been hearing at school board meetings across this country, is actually a term used for critical race theory and it's a theory used to explain systemic racism. I mean, it's mainly taught at the upper levels of college classes. It's not sitting there in your third grade classroom. It's not sitting there in my classroom. Do we deal with equity and equality? Absolutely. But, you know, these phrases that are being thrown out, they're not the same thing. And perhaps there's some confusion literally over the names, thinking that when someone sees CRT and it's culturally responsive teaching, that it's actually critical race theory and that people are indoctrinating children. It's not those things. You know, and we shouldn't be afraid to ask those questions like, what is this? But when people are just standing out there shouting, we don't need this, we don't want this, and they can't tell us what it is, I invite them to please, let's do some research. And ask people that do know.
Ask some questions. And your child's teacher, all teachers are going to be a great start for that. And then there are other people that you can talk to with. I know that districts across the country are welcoming families, parents, community partners in on discussions and advisory boards and all those things. So get involved and start with questions. And so along those lines, we wanted to talk about launching this school year. For us, the first day of school is this week. For many, it might be next week after Labor Day, and some people may have already started. And so we're facing, again, a year with a lot of questions, a year with a lot of challenges, a year with a lot of uncertainty. And sometimes that can be scary, and that can overwhelm us. And so when we were thinking about that, we thought, it's also an opportunity to really bring in the energy and lead the learning. We already know that this year, again, might look different than a year 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So let's embrace that when and how we can, and let's do some things a little bit differently, jump into that. And the first piece to that is knowing that kids haven't been in the classrooms much. And I was in a webinar just this morning where the leader of this talked about how this year's second graders, where we are in Vancouver, Washington, we're only in the classroom a handful of months for first grade, the majority of which they were at home. And then their kindergarten year was interrupted. First graders.
That's my daughter, by the way.
That's your daughter, yeah. And first graders this year had a very strange kindergarten year. And then we can look at freshmen. We can look at sixth graders. We can look at how different students are. And that can really be a push to leading with social emotional learning. And I know this is one of the buzzwords that connects to what we were just talking about, but we got to remember that what we expect, or what our lens for learning 5-10 years ago, is a lens that needs refreshing now, that can be updated, saying, okay, so a student is not in practice being in this classroom. What can I do to help them? How can I start every activity, every transition I do, reteaching or teaching for the first time, how we can do this learning thing together, how we can leverage the goodness we have in a classroom.
Yeah, and on that note, like, we had a new student orientation last week at our school, and I met some kids who are actually 7th graders this year, but, you know, because of the pandemic, they never stepped foot into school. They didn't come during hybrid, so literally they are brand new to our school. They've never met their classmates in person. And so, you know, remembering those things, as well as, you know, not everyone from last year knows each other, even if they're continuing on in certain different programs. And, you know, kind of, you know, it's kind of hit the reset button with a lot of things. And having said that, one of the things that is interesting to me is, especially kids who haven't necessarily known each other, or they can be quiet, right? And I don't know about you, but I love a noisy classroom.
Me too. Love the noisy classroom.
You know, granted, there's times where we need it to be quiet,
Sure.
right? When assessments are happening and stuff like that. But so much of what I do, and I know what Erin has done, and a lot of teachers do, is collaboration, right? These ideas that we just need the kids to sit in rows and be quiet and listen to a teacher talk. I know that happens, and if that's your teaching style, so be it. But that's not mine. And we need kids to be able to collaborate in multiple ways. If this last year and a half has shown us anything, is, you know, communicating face to face, the kids haven't done that in a while. So they've learned to communicate via text or via email or whatever Insta-chat thing they're using. And so learning how to communicate face to face now is going to be a big piece. And, you know, standing up and presenting to a class or to an authentic audience is going to be something new, and it needs to be practiced and encouraged, because otherwise those kids won't be as prepared for life later on, because as we all know, you communicate in the real world when you're done with school.
It gets noisy. It's like those times when you get super excited on ideas and you're talking with each other. And I think that the data you can collect, the formative assessment data, right, those pieces that let you know, are the kids learning what I wanted them to learn? Or have they gone a whole new direction? Or where am I missing, you know, this piece that I wanted them to learn? A great place to catch that is when they're talking with each other. How do I know that it's time to move on? Well, those students have finished and now they're talking about this other thing. So you get so much out of noise. And like you said, practicing together again might get a little noisy. And that reminds me of another piece to this, and that's leveraging resources. Because as we talked about earlier, we want to approach this year not as, you know, students have not accomplished this or not learned this. We want to approach it as, okay, where are they at? How can we measure where my students are at with whatever standards I need to cover? They might be somewhere different. They might be, you know, way far ahead. We don't know based on our plans where they're at until we do those assessments. And that can seem like a big burden, especially if you have a lot of subjects you're teaching, a lot of students. So leveraging resources is really important right now. And so I know in our district we have some great tools for collecting how students are doing and checking in with them in those spaces, such as some of Google Forms is one way to do that. I know many districts have SEL curriculum software that will let you check in with the students so you can say, how did today's lesson go? How did it work with me as a teacher? What can I give you that's different? So that if you're trying to manage that volume of data, but you know it's important to connect with students, let your tools work for you. We have a lot of great curriculum that's available out there too, so that you don't have to invent all these different levels. So if you're teaching a subject, you find you have students at very different places of learning, use that curriculum to help you connect with each child. Use your curriculum support people at your district and say, hey, how can I check in with these different students? We have administrators, we have counselors, we have lots of people, and most importantly, your colleagues working together in a group, whether you want to call it a professional learning community or it's your coffee at Thursdays at 8 a.m., whichever one it is, use each other to help you.
And I'll say this, leverage the other students in the classroom, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then this gets back to the noisy classroom. Oh, so-and-so, hey, one person knows this. Hey, you want to show how to do this? Giving those students those extra little roles to teach their fellow classmates or something, like a role of leadership within a classroom, is so empowering. And
Absolutely.
I mean, I remember, just real quick anecdote, when we were first doing like some of the 360 imaging like 6 years ago, I taught I was teaching lessons, and one kid just like, he loved it. And so I'm like, you know what? I'm gonna have you come in. We worked with the other teachers to like get him out of the classroom for a little bit, and he came in and taught the lesson. And it's such a different thing when your students are learning from someone else.
So true.
Which
so true.
Segues into our next piece, which is partnerships. There are so many great organizations out there that want to work with schools, but just quite frankly don't know how. And it's hard sometimes as a teacher to say, well, you go out there, put yourself out there, like, can you help with this? But one thing that I've learned is when I ask, hey, here's an idea I have, here's a pitch, it's very rare that a community says no, because they're invested in making sure our kids get a good education too. And so a lot of times they want to help and don't know how.
Absolutely. I know that we have a great partner in Vancouver in Shinetsu, our SEH America that's here, and they love coming into classrooms. I did a great piece with one of their professionals last year who said, it's worth my while to reach in and support high school teachers, to get to know our high school students, because they're going to be my future employees in 3, 4, 5 years. They're the ones that we want to give internships to, and it helps us reach out and say, hey, we have this program, we want to support you and launch you into a family wage sustaining career. And so having a teacher to be that connector can be a really magical thing for students. And I know the organizations want to come down. They want to get computer science in the hands of our kindergartners. They want that because they know that that's where our future innovators are. It's in our classrooms today.
And it's one thing for like Erin and I to like stand and talk about like the science of Mount St. Helens and things like that, but when someone like Christine comes in and talks about her one-on-one experiences, or we have the scientists who were literally in a documentary that we were watching like the week before because they're conducting science, and now they're in the classroom talking to those kids, that carries more weight than we could. And it's
so cool.
It's the same thing as, I could teach annotated bibliographies, and I do, but sometimes bringing the librarian into your classroom, just have that different voice in your classroom from time to time, changes things up and allows students to know that your subject or what you're learning isn't just within the classroom from this one person, right? We can all learn from one another. And that there are experts out there like, hey, I never thought I could be an archaeologist or would want to be, but oh wait, that's science and that's social studies, and it's all these things tied in. I get to get my hands dirty, like that's kind of cool, play in the dirt. It was fun to see Fort Vancouver's piece this summer with the Portland State University, and like literally they're digging the trenches over by the Columbia River to excavate different artifacts and things like that, and that was open to the public. And it was fun for me. I went on one day, was just kind of standing on the periphery and watching all these people on the bicycle path stopping, and they'd never encountered an archaeological dig before.
Citizen science,
right? And it's those things, and they want to come to your classroom. They want to. A lot of these museums or other scientific organizations, they even have like school curriculum set up specifically designed to go into your school. You just have to ask.
Absolutely. So the next thing that we wanted to talk about would be connecting with your students to find out, okay, which resources do I need? Which partnerships would be of importance to my students? Where are they at? And
to me, connecting with students, especially the ones like we haven't seen some of them in a long time. And so you got to get to know them. And the very first thing we need to do is learn their names and learn how to pronounce them properly, and not just give nicknames to kids if it's hard to pronounce. allow them the opportunity to share their pronouns if they want to. Some kids may not want to, which is totally fine. But for others, that simple recognition of acknowledging them as a human being is one of the greatest things that we can do for a child's psyche. And when they feel safe in a classroom, they're going to learn more. And, I do remember one time I was still student teaching. I was visiting a school one time, and it was like November, and I saw a teacher just, instead of calling kids by name, it was like, you back there, and I was just like, that hurt me. We're not perfect. It's going to take a little while to learn all the different names and how to pronounce them. But as long as the kids know that you're trying and you're going to get there, then that's all they want, right? They want to be seen and they want to be heard.
And one of the phrases I use often, I think last year I had to learn 205 names. So that was one of the bigger years that I've had pretty quickly, is to let students know this is important to me. As part of the thing, can you please help me with this? This is important to me. Making sure that not only are you telling the student that, but you're telling yourself that, especially if that's a practice that you're not used to, or you want to make sure that you are very thoughtfully getting deep into supporting students right now, knowing the tender place that they may be in because of the pandemic. So saying this is important to me, you're affirming that to yourself and to them. And so that's one thing that I super encourage. And you're also modeling to them how to treat each other in the classroom. We talked about the noisy classroom. We talked about culturally responsive teaching. Modeling how to treat each other that's kind of like step one is being a teacher. That's your role. You're not there to dictate science. You're there to show how we learn, whatever the subject may be. And we learn together, we learn with respect. And along those lines, bringing into your instruction attention to the culture of your students. And so we talked about those resources and those partnerships, knowing what's important to your students and their future, checking in about that, checking in to where maybe they have families that are rich in an industry. I had students, one of my Syrian refugees, his parent was in chemistry. He was in a really fascinating field where they were working on heart valves, and he was looking at the chemical aspects of all the different fluids that go through heart valves. And it was fascinating listening to that and thinking about how the chemistry of what the different valves would interact with chemistry of the body. He's talking about rejection of things that are and he was talking just in a meet and greet open house, but 4, 5, 6 students walked over and were like, what? They started eavesdropping in. So that was a hint to me, hey, I have this rich resource of a person who has this experience, and let's bring that in. Let's talk about that. And so when we're thinking about the culture of your students, what's important to them, their interests, their families, their backgrounds, one of the ways to do that, if you're just launching your school year, is tracking. How often are you including students in decisions? Is that your first or maybe second filter? Your first filter might be, okay, what am I allowed to do given the space and safety and time with COVID? Understandable. But the second part could be, did I include students in this? Where did it come from? Because if not, maybe a different topic would be better this year, or a different avenue for learning. So really bringing it back to the students at every decision point is so important.
Yeah, you want to try to have some voice and choice in that. There's certain things where projects are going like I do, and there's constraints, and it's like, hey, but even within that project, hey, you're going to build one of these 4 things, right? You get to, hey, out of these topics that we have right here, what are your top 3, right? And allowing those to make those decisions, because if we don't start allowing children to answer questions and make decisions for their own, all of a sudden they graduate high school and now they're being asked to make decisions, and it's not something they've ever done before. So we need to start where it's guided sometimes, especially in like middle school, but eventually it gets to be a release, and you can start to give the students some more autonomy and things like that.
And so we've talked a lot about today where to start and how to launch a year, where to put some energy, maybe in a different direction than we have had in prior years. But we do want to acknowledge that the pandemic is going to end at some point. We are going to put a closure on this, and we've learned a lot. So we want to think about, as we're closing this episode out, what will we keep? You're at a different place now than you were a year ago or even 2 years ago. So what changes have been helpful for students? What things have come about that, whatever way they came, whether it was a tragic situation, whether it was a forced change on your part to learn something new, what are we going to keep from that experience? And then importantly, the flip side of that is, what are we ditching? What are we getting rid of? What did not serve us, or more importantly, our students well before this pandemic, that we have learned, maybe in some ways the hard way, is not the right thing to do for students? And so keeping those things in mind are what we want to do as we're moving through this school year as well.
Yeah. And to that end is too, as educators, we've got professional development all the time. We're always going out, or hopefully going out and seeking new things and learning from one another. And so what is your role moving forward? Are you going to be passive and just kind of take the PD that's given to you at your school building, or can you go out there and seek out some new things, take on some new roles? And some of you are completely stressed, and that's not right for you right now. Great. Hopefully we can get to a point where we have a good space in our mind and our body where we can begin to move forward and think about, like, well, you know what, I kind of like that, but I didn't really know that much about it, so I'm going to go learn some more about it. Looking at how close reading strategies might help literacy for all students. And like, hey, I'm a math teacher, but I'm going to start reading some more articles in my classroom because I know that's going to benefit not just my class, but just the student overall, rather than just looking at my small specialty.
Thank you for tuning in. This was wonderful for us to get back into the recording studio at Vancouver Public Schools. So thank you, Ian, who has been helping us with this. Just like educators across the country and across the globe, we're figuring it out one day at a time, one foot in front of the other, one conversation in front of the other, to figure it out, to move forward, to be reflective about what we're taking with us. So if you feel like you're alone in any aspect of teaching, you're not. Please reach out. If you're a new teacher, please reach out. People want to support you. We want to support you. We want you supported and staying in what we think is the best profession in the world. I mean, we are biased, but we want to make sure that you're not alone and lost, and that we can be there for you. And there are people at your school, at your learning place, that feel the same. Yeah. So thank you for joining us.
If you're being told to just fold it in, just fold it in.
Just fold it in.
Remember, reach out to people. There are people that know how to fold it in. And will help you.
Or at least sit there and be like, yep, fold it in. I know. So we don't want anyone out there by themselves. So thank you for listening to us. Thank you for letting us reach out to you. We hope to be back again next month, still in the studio, keeping it safe.
Yeah. And once again, thank you to my brother, Son of Starkiller, for the intro and outro music. And keep those conversations going.